Lorraine Bischoff was 74 years old, and she had exactly $6 to her name when she raised her hand at a county salvage auction in Bellweather Junction, Montana, and bid on a locked railroad car that had been sealed shut for 90 years. The crowd laughed. A man with a camera zoomed in on her face. A young woman in expensive boots called her grandma and asked, loud enough for the whole lot to hear, whether anyone had checked if she'd taken her pills that morning. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that the rusted Pullman car she'd just bought for the price of a cheap sandwich had been waiting almost a century for the right person to open it, and that what was sealed inside would solve a federal cold case older than anyone in that crowd, send shockwaves through 3 states, and turn the woman they were laughing at into the answer to a question the FBI had stopped asking decades ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Lorraine had learned, the hard way, that widowhood doesn't kill you the way grief is supposed to in the movies. It doesn't drop you to your knees in a single dramatic moment with sad music swelling in the background. It works slower than that, quieter. It erases you in increments, so small you can't quite point to the day it started. A bank statement here, an unanswered phone call there, a son who used to come for Sunday dinner and now sends a text message twice a year. Pieces of you go missing one at a time, until 18 months after you bury your husband, you wake up in a borrowed trailer behind a roadside diner, count the change in your coat pocket, and realize the world has officially stopped accounting for you. Wendell Bischoff had been her husband for 46 years. He had also been a railroad mechanic for the Burlington Northern Line for 40 of those years, a man whose hands smelled permanently of grease and copper, who could fall asleep at the kitchen table mid-sentence and still finish the thought when he woke up. He had died the way men like him often did, quietly, in his recliner, with the local news on, 18 months before the morning of the auction. The doctor said his heart had simply stopped, the way an old engine stops when the bearings finally give. Lorraine had found him still warm. She had sat with him for almost an hour before she called anyone, because she knew the moment she made that call, he would stop being hers and start being a body, a paperwork problem, a series of bureaucratic transactions that would consume the next year of her life. She had been right about the paperwork. What she hadn't anticipated was Kent. Kent was Wendell's son from his first marriage, raised mostly by his mother in Billings, brought into Lorraine's life as a sullen teenager, and never quite warmed up to her in the 4 decades since. Lorraine had tried. She had baked the birthday cakes, sent the Christmas cards, attended the wedding when Kent married Brielle, sat through the awkward holiday dinners where Brielle made it clear with her eyes alone that Lorraine was tolerated, not welcomed. When Wendell was alive, Kent had been a distant but functional presence. After Wendell died, he became something else entirely, something cold, inefficient, and calculated. The house went first. Wendell, like a lot of men of his generation, had handled the finances himself, and he had not updated his will since 1998. The deed to the small 2-bedroom house in Bellweather Junction, where Lorraine had lived for 31 years, was in his name alone. Kent had a lawyer, a quick-talking man from Missoula, and within 4 months of the funeral, Lorraine was being told in carefully chosen language that the house was technically part of Wendell's estate and that the estate, after taxes and a probate process Lorraine didn't fully understand, would be passing to Kent as Wendell's only biological heir. There were forms to sign. There was talk of fair compensation that was never actually quantified. There were sympathetic phone calls from Brielle that always ended with the suggestion that Lorraine might be more comfortable somewhere less stressful. The day she signed the papers, Brielle drove her to a senior apartment complex on the edge of town and pointed out the cheerful yellow curtains in the model unit, as if curtains were a substitute for 31 years of life. Lorraine lasted 4 months in that apartment. The money Kent had given her, what he called fair compensation, turned out to be exactly $6,000, less than 2 months of rent at the place he'd put her in. By the time she understood what had been done to her, by the time she sat down with the few documents she had and tried to add the numbers together, the math was already a tombstone. Wendell's pension, which she had assumed would continue, had been a single-life annuity that ended the day he died. The Social Security survivor benefit was less than half of what they had lived on together. The savings account had her name on it, but was emptied during probate to pay debts she hadn't known existed. She moved her belongings into a 1978 Airstream trailer behind Marchetti's Diner on Highway 12, rented to her for $200 a month by a kind, exhausted woman named Dottie Marchetti, who pretended she didn't see Lorraine washing her clothes in the diner's utility sink at 5 in the morning. Dottie also pretended she didn't notice when Lorraine ate the same single bowl of soup at the counter every day, paid for in coins, and refused all offers of a free refill. That was the life Lorraine was living on the morning the flyer appeared, taped to the diner's front window, advertising the Bellweather County salvage auction. Public lot. Final disposition of seized and abandoned property. All bids accepted. The flyer was bright orange, almost cheerful, and Lorraine read it 3 times before she understood what she was reading. She didn't have a plan. She had $6 folded into the inside pocket of Wendell's old denim coat, the only piece of him she had managed to keep, and she had a vague, stubborn instinct that something was waiting for her. She didn't know what. She didn't know how she knew. She just knew that a woman with $6 and no future had nothing left to lose by walking 3 miles down a county road on a cold March morning to watch other people's discarded lives go up for sale. She zipped the coat to her chin, tucked the bills deeper into the pocket, and started walking. The Bellweather County salvage lot sat at the dead end of a gravel road behind the courthouse, a fenced rectangle of asphalt and weeds where the county dumped whatever it couldn't legally throw away. Abandoned vehicles, repossessed equipment, storage units the renters had walked away from. Once or twice a year, the county clerk's office held a public auction to clear the lot before the items had to be hauled to the landfill at taxpayer expense. And a particular kind of person showed up for these auctions. Contractors looking for cheap tools, scrappers with flatbed trailers, and in the last few years, a new species, men and women with cameras and ring lights, filming themselves bidding on storage units and rusted cars for a YouTube audience that apparently couldn't get enough of strangers digging through other people's discarded lives. Lorraine arrived just before 9 in the morning, walking in through the open gate with her hands deep in the pockets of Wendell's denim coat. She was the oldest person there by at least 20 years. She knew at the moment she crossed the threshold. Heads turned. A man in coveralls gave her the brief, polite nod people give old women they assume are lost. A woman in a contractor's vest looked her up and down once, and then went back to her clipboard. Lorraine kept walking, found a spot near the back of the crowd against the chain-link fence, and pulled the brim of her wool hat lower over her eyes. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Bert Halverson, who Lorraine vaguely recognized from a church potluck Wendell had dragged her to 15 years ago. He was in his 60s now, red-faced from the cold, and he ran the auction the way a tired pastor runs a long sermon, methodically, without enthusiasm, eager to be finished. The county clerk, a thin woman with a clipboard named Lurleen Sparks, stood beside him calling out lot numbers in a flat voice that suggested she had somewhere else she would rather be. The first hour moved fast. A flatbed pickup with a blown transmission went for $900. A storage unit full of power tools went to a contractor for $2,000. A motorcycle that hadn't run since the Reagan administration sold for $50 to a man who looked like he was buying it just to say he had. The crowd thinned as the better lots disappeared. By 10:30, only the dregs remained, and that was when Lorraine first noticed the men with the cameras. There were 3 of them, working as a unit. The leader was a tall man in his early 30s with a sculpted beard and the kind of expensive flannel shirt that costs more than it looks like it costs. Lorraine would later learn his name was Chase Ormsby, and that he ran a YouTube channel called Junkyard Kings with 1.4 million subscribers. Behind him, a wiry younger man named Tanner Fielding worked a shoulder-mounted camera with practiced ease. And off to the side, a striking woman in her late 20s with platinum hair and a clipboard, Sloane Devereaux, Chase's producer and girlfriend, directed shots with small, precise hand signals. They had bought aggressively all morning, picking up storage units and old vehicles with the casual confidence of people spending other people's money. They had also been performing the entire time. Every bid was punctuated with a grin to the camera, a one-liner, a thumbs up. Lorraine watched them from beneath the brim of her hat, and felt something old and tired turn over in her chest. She had spent 46 years married to a man who measured his life in honest hours and grease under his fingernails. These three were measuring theirs in views. "All right, folks." Bert Halverson's voice crackled across the lot. "We're down to the last lot of the day. Lot 47. This here is, let me see. This is one railroad passenger car, manufactured 1928 by the Pullman Company, currently sitting on a disconnected stretch of track at mile marker 7 on the old Burlington Spur, 3 miles east of here. Property was seized in 2008 for unpaid back taxes from the estate of one Ezra Caraway, deceased. County's been carrying it on the books for 16 years. Nobody's claimed it. Nobody's wanted it." He squinted at his clipboard. "Building inspector's notes say the car is structurally sound, but the original locks are still in place, and the county does not possess a key. Buyer takes it as is. No warranty. No representations. Tracks included. You'll need a flatbed and a crane to move it, or you can leave it where it sits and just take title." A long silence followed. The crowd shifted on its feet. Somebody coughed. "Opening bid. Let's say $100. Nothing. 50. A man near the front actually laughed. Bert sighed. "Folks, we have to clear this lot. The county doesn't want to pay to demolish it. I'll take any bid. $10. Anybody." That was when Chase Ormsby turned to his cameraman and grinned wide enough for the lens to catch every tooth. "Hey, Bert," he called out, voice pitch for the microphone clipped to his collar. "What if I bid 5? Just for content?" The crowd laughed. Tanner swung the camera around to capture Chase's smirk. Sloan gave a small approving nod. "I'll take 5, Bert said, exhausted. $6. The voice was small but clear, and it came from the back of the crowd. Every head turned at once. Bert squinted toward the chain-link fence, trying to locate the bidder. Lorraine stepped forward half a pace, just enough to be seen, and lifted her chin. $6, she said again. For one long moment, no one in the lot made a sound. Chase Ormsby's grin faltered for exactly half a second before he recovered, which was the half-second Lorraine remembered most clearly afterward. She saw him calculate, saw the small flicker of irritation that an old woman in a denim coat had just outbid him on his content moment. And then she saw him decide, with the practiced fluency of a man who had built a career on it, that her interruption could be content too. He turned slowly toward the camera and let his eyebrows climb. Hold on. He waved one hand at Bert Halverson without taking his eyes off the lens. Tanner, are you getting this? Please tell me you're getting this. Tanner gave a small thumbs up from behind the viewfinder. Chase pivoted, walking 3 slow steps toward the back of the crowd until he was close enough to Lorraine that she could smell his cologne. He didn't look at her directly. He looked just past her, into the lens, addressing his audience. Ma'am. He held up both hands in mock concern. Ma'am, I just want to make sure you understand what you're bidding on here. That is a 97-year-old railroad car. It has been sitting in a field for almost 100 years. The county itself does not have a key to it. The building inspector said it's structurally sound, but structurally sound to a county building inspector and structurally sound in real life are not always the same conversation. You understand. Lorraine kept her eyes on Bert. $6, she said for the 3rd time. I'd like to complete the bid. Sloan Devereaux laughed, a sharp musical sound that carried across the lot. Oh my God, Chase, she's going to do it. I think she is. Chase finally swung his head toward Lorraine, still performing for the camera. Grandma, listen, I'm worried about you. I'm just going to say it. I'm worried. Is somebody picking you up from this? Do you have a ride? Has anyone here seen this woman's family? Is there a number we can call? The crowd laughed. Not all of them. Lorraine noticed that. A man in coveralls near the auctioneer's table looked at the ground and didn't laugh. A woman with a contractor's clipboard pressed her lips into a thin line and stared somewhere over Chase's shoulder. But enough of them laughed. Enough that the laughter found its rhythm, found its shape, became the kind of laughter that travels up your spine like a chill no matter how many decades you've been alive. $6 going once, Bert said pointedly. Hey, I'll go 7, Chase called out, his face cracking into a wide showman's grin. $7. Just to keep the bidding interesting. Just to make sure Grandma here gets her money's worth in entertainment. 8. Lorraine said. A small gasp went through the crowd. Sloan stopped laughing. $8 from the lady in the back, Bert said, and there was something different in his voice now. Lorraine couldn't quite name it. Not respect, exactly. Closer to attention. The quality a man's voice takes on when he realizes the situation has changed shape under him, and he isn't sure yet what shape it has taken. Chase looked at Sloan. Sloan gave the smallest shake of her head. The math had shifted. A bidding war with a frail-looking elderly woman on camera over a worthless railroad car. It had been funny at $6 and funny at $7, but the calculation past $8 was different. If he bid $9, he was a man who beat an old woman in a coat for content. If he didn't, he was a man who got outbid by an old woman in a coat for content. There was no version of the next move that played well on the algorithm. You know what? Chase swung his arms wide and grinned for the lens one more time. I'm going to let her have it. Folks, I'm going to let her have it. Because I'm a gentleman, and because I'm pretty sure that car is going to kill her before sundown anyway, and I do not want that on my conscience. Grandma, it's all yours. Enjoy. The laughter came back, harder this time. $8 going once. Going twice. Sold to the lady in the back for $8. Bert banged his clipboard against the table. Lot 47. We're done, folks. At the auction. Lorraine walked to the auctioneer's table on legs that did not feel entirely her own. She passed within 3 feet of Tanner's camera, and the lens followed her the entire way, and she did not look at it. She reached the table and counted out the $8 in a small, careful pile. 6 $1 bills from the inside pocket of Wendell's coat, and 2 more she had folded into her glove for emergencies, and pushed the pile across to Lurleen Sparks. Lurleen took the money without making eye contact. She slid a clipboard across with a paper to sign. She handed Lorraine a pink carbon copy receipt and a heavy iron key on a tarnished brass ring, the kind of key Lorraine had not seen since she was a child. The key was the length of her palm and weighed more than it should have. Title's yours, Lurleen said quietly, in a voice the cameras couldn't pick up. Watch yourself out there, Mrs. Bischoff. The road past mile marker 7 is rough. Lorraine looked at her sharply. Lurleen had used her name. They had not exchanged names. Lurleen met her eyes for half a second, then dropped her gaze to the clipboard and called the next number, which there wasn't, because the auction was over. Lorraine closed her fingers around the key, slipped it into the inside pocket of Wendell's coat where the bills had been, and walked out of the salvage lot with her chin up and her eyes forward, and she did not look back at the cameras. Not once. The walk back to Marchetti's diner took Lorraine almost an hour. She walked it slowly, the iron key heavy against her ribs through the lining of Wendell's coat, and she tried, the whole way, not to think about Chase Ormsby's voice. Grandma, listen, I'm worried about you. She tried not to think about Sloan Devereaux's laugh. She tried not to think about the camera lens following her like a small black that had seen everything she'd spent her life hoping no one would ever see. What she thought about instead, against her will, was the car. A 1928 Pullman. Burr Halverson had said it twice. Manufactured 1928 by the Pullman Company. The phrase had snagged on something in her memory the first time she heard it. And now, walking with her hands deep in her pockets and her breath misting in front of her face, the snag began to pull loose. Wendell had worked on Pullmans. Not often. Not many of them came through the Burlington Northern Yards by the time he was working, because most had been retired by the 70s. But Wendell had loved them. He had loved them the way other men loved certain cars, certain rifles, certain breeds of dogs. They built those cars to outlast the country. Lorry, he used to say, sitting at the kitchen table with a beer at his elbow and a service manual open in front of him. Pullman didn't make junk. Pullman made the kind of thing where you could shut the door in 1930 and open it again in 1980, and the inside would still smell like cigars and aftershave. He had once, on their 20th anniversary, taken her to a railroad museum in Spokane just to walk her through a restored 1925 Pullman parlor car, and he had pointed out, with the reverence of a man in a cathedral, the brass fixtures, the inlaid wood, the original locks. Original locks, Lorry. Look at that. Pullman ordered those locks custom from a company in Connecticut. You can't pick those locks. You can drill them, but you'll ruin the door, and you can't replace the door because the company that made the doors went out of business in 1942. She stopped walking in the middle of the gravel road. She stood there for almost a full minute with her eyes closed, letting the memory finish unspooling. A 1928 Pullman, Bird had said. Original locks still in place. The county does not possess a key. And in her pocket, against her ribs, the iron key the county did not possess. She started walking again, faster now. When she reached the Airstream behind Marchetti's diner, she did not go inside. She stood in the gravel parking lot for a long time, looking at the trailer, looking past it at the back wall of the diner where the kitchen vent was pumping out the smell of fryer grease and coffee, and she thought, with a clarity she hadn't felt in 18 months, I need Silas. Silas Beecham had been Wendell's closest friend for 37 years. He was 81 now, a widower himself, living in a small cinder-block house on the edge of town with a yard full of garden gnomes his late wife had collected. He had retired from the Burlington Northern as a senior locomotive engineer in 2009, and he had cried harder at Wendell's funeral than Lorraine had, an honest, gulping sob at the back of the church that she had been too numb to be embarrassed by. Lorraine had not seen him since the funeral. He had called twice in the first month, and she had been too tired to answer the phone. And then he had stopped calling, the way old men do when they're trying to be respectful and don't know they're slipping out of someone's life by being polite. She walked across the highway to the gas station and used the payphone outside the bathrooms. There was still one, the last one in Bellweather County, and she dropped 2 of her remaining coins into the slot and dialed a number she had not dialed in 18 months but remembered the way a person remembers a hymn. He picked up on the second ring. Silas, she said, it's Lorraine Bischoff. I need your help with something Wendell would have wanted you to help me with. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then his voice, gravelly and careful, the voice of a man who had not been spoken to in 48 hours and was rationing his words. Where are you, Lori? Marchetti's diner. The trailer out back. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 15, in a 1996 Ford F-150 that Wendell had helped him rebuild from the frame up, and he climbed down out of the cab with the slow, careful unfolding of a man whose knees were no longer on speaking terms with the rest of him. He walked across the gravel toward her without saying a word, and when he reached her, he wrapped her in a hug that smelled of pipe tobacco and motor oil and the faint clean wool of his good winter coat, and he held her there for a long time without speaking. When he finally stepped back, he looked at her face for a long moment, taking in everything that 18 months had done to it. Wendell would skin me alive, he said quietly. I'm sorry I let it get this far. Silas. She took the iron key out of her coat pocket and held it up between them in the cold afternoon light. I bought a 1928 Pullman this morning for $8. The county didn't have a key. I'd like you to drive me out to mile marker 7. Silas Beecham looked at the key. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said very softly, Get in the truck, Lori. The old Burlington Spur was a stretch of disconnected track that ran east out of Bellweather Junction along the bottom of a shallow draw, parallel to a county road that almost nobody used anymore. Silas drove it in silence, hands easy on the wheel, the way a man drives a road he has driven for 40 years. Lorraine sat in the passenger seat with the iron key in her lap and watched the landscape thin out, fence posts leaning at angles, a windmill missing 2 blades, an old stockyard with the gate hanging open. The sun was low and the light was the color of weak tea. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They came around a long, slow curve, and Silas slowed the truck without being told. Mile marker 7 was a faded white concrete post leaning into the bunch grass, and just beyond it, set back maybe 50 feet from the road on a stub of orphaned track, sat the railroad car. Lorraine had not let herself picture it on the drive over, and she was glad now that she hadn't, because no picture she could have made would have prepared her for the actual thing. It was longer than she'd expected, 70 feet, maybe more. The exterior was the deep maroon brown of old oxidized paint, streaked with rust at the seams, but the body was straight, the windows unbroken, the roof intact. Brass hardware, dulled almost black by 90 winters, still gripped the corners of every door and window. The trucks underneath, the heavy steel wheel assemblies, were sunk into the ballast as if the car had decided, sometime in the Roosevelt administration, that this was where it was going to stay. Silas pulled the truck onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. He sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. "Lori," he said quietly, "I need you to understand what you bought. Tell me, that is not a passenger car." He nodded through the windshield. "The proportions are wrong. The window spacing, the vestibule on the rear, that's a private car. A business car. Pullman built maybe 200 of those between 1920 and 1940, and almost every one of them was custom ordered by somebody with serious money. Railroad executives, senators, a couple of movie studios. They were the private jets of their day." Lorraine looked at the car. She thought about the $8. She thought about Chase Ormsby's grin. How did one of them end up out here? "That, I cannot tell you." Silas opened his door. "Let's go find out." He had brought a canvas tool roll, a flashlight the size of a small log, and a thermos of coffee. Lorraine carried the key. They walked across the gravel and the dead grass to the rear vestibule, and Silas climbed the small iron stairs first, testing each one with his weight before trusting it. Lorraine followed. The door was a heavy panel of mahogany, weathered almost gray, with a brass plate set into it at chest height. The plate held a single circular keyhole. Silas crouched. He angled the flashlight into the keyhole and studied it for almost a minute without speaking. "I will be damned," he said. "What?" "Pullman lever lock. Original. I have not seen one of these outside a museum in 35 years. He looked up at her. "Lori, this lock has not been opened since whoever last closed it." Lorraine handed him the key. He took it the way a man takes communion. He turned it over twice in his hands, ran his thumb across the cuts along the bit, then leaned forward and slid it carefully into the keyhole. There was a moment of resistance. He paused. He worked it gently. A quarter turned back, then forward, and the lock made a sound Lorraine had never heard before, a deep mechanical thunk like a heavy book closing in another room. The door eased outward an inch on its own weight. Silas stood up slowly and looked at her. "Whatever's in there has been in there since that key last turned," he said. "You ready?" She wasn't. She nodded anyway. He pulled the door open the rest of the way, and the smell hit them first, not rot, not mildew, but something stranger and more specific. Cold, dry air, pipe tobacco, furniture polish, the ghost of a cigar smoked in 1934. Lorraine put her hand to her mouth without meaning to, because it was the smell of every train story Wendell had ever told her, made suddenly real, 90 years late. Silas swept the flashlight across the interior. The beam caught brass first. Wall sconces along a narrow corridor, polished mahogany paneling, a strip of inlaid maple along the ceiling. Then it caught fabric, a long banquette upholstered in dark green velvet, dust-coated but intact. Then a writing desk built into the wall with a leather blotter still on it, and on the blotter, a fountain pen lying exactly where someone had set it down. Lorraine made a small sound that was not quite a word. Silas stepped inside carefully, testing the floor. The boards held. He moved the beams slowly down the corridor, past a small galley kitchen with copper pots still hanging from a rack, past a sleeping compartment with a bed neatly made under a sheet that had gone the color of old ivory, past a private bathroom with a porcelain sink and a brass faucet shaped like a swan's neck. At the far end of the car, the corridor opened into a larger space. What would have been the parlor, the entertaining room. Silas stopped at the threshold. The flashlight beam went still. "Lori," he said. His voice had changed. "What? You need to come look at this. But you need to come slow." Lorraine moved down the corridor the way Silas had told her to, slowly, one hand on the mahogany paneling for balance. The floor creaked under her weight, but did not give. The flashlight beam was still pointing into the parlor at the end of the car, and from where she was, she could not yet see what Silas was seeing. She could only see his back, his shoulders pulled tight, the small, unsteady tremor in his arm where he was holding the light. She came up beside him at the threshold. The parlor was wider than the corridor, paneled in the same dark mahogany, with two facing leather club chairs bolted to the floor and a small round card table between them. A crystal decanter sat on the table, a quarter full of something that had probably once been bourbon and was now a dark resin. Two glasses sat beside it. One of them had been knocked on its side. Against the far wall, stacked with the careful precision of something military, were canvas mailbags. Lorraine counted them automatically because she could not yet take in the rest of what she was seeing. There were 14. Each bag was tied at the neck with a heavy hemp cord and sealed with a lead crimp the size of a quarter. Each bag had been stenciled in faded black ink along the side, and the stenciling, even after 90 years, was still legible. Property of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. 1934. Lorraine's hand went to her chest without her telling it to. "Silas," she said. "I see them, Lori." "Silas, what?" "I see them." He moved the flashlight beam slowly to the right, away from the bags, along the far wall. And that was when Lorraine saw the rest of it. In the corner of the parlor, slumped sideways into one of the club chairs, was what had once been a man. The uniform was the first thing she registered because the uniform was almost intact, a heavy dark wool coat with brass buttons running down the front, the kind of double-breasted railway uniform she had seen in old photographs hanging on the walls of the Burlington Northern offices when Wendell was still working there. A conductor's cap had fallen to the floor beside the chair. What was inside the uniform was mostly bone, the long, quiet bones of a man who had sat down in a leather chair on a train car in 1934 and never gotten up again. Silas lowered the flashlight. Lorraine could hear him breathing. "Lori, walk back to the door. Don't touch anything. Don't touch the floor more than you have to. Walk back to the door right now." She walked back. Silas followed her. He pulled the heavy mahogany door shut behind them, not quite latching it, and he climbed down the iron steps to the gravel and did not stop walking until he reached the truck. He opened the passenger door for her. She climbed in. He went around to the driver's side and got in himself, and he sat there for a long moment with both hands flat on the steering wheel. Then he reached across her, opened the glove box, took out an old flip phone, and dialed 911. The Bellweather County dispatcher who took the call was a woman named Reba, who had worked the desk for 26 years and had never, in all of that time, taken a call that began with, "This is Silas Beecham out at mile marker 7 on the Burlington Spur, and I believe we have located human remains and what appears to be federal property." She put him through to the sheriff's department directly. The first vehicle to arrive was a county sheriff's cruiser with its lights off, driven by a deputy who looked about 23. He took one look inside the open door of the Pullman, put his hat back on, walked back to his cruiser, and called for a detective. The detective who arrived 40 minutes later was a woman in her late 30s named Imani Okafor, with close-cropped hair and the kind of calm, patient face that Lorraine immediately trusted without quite knowing why. Detective Okafor introduced herself, took Lorraine's name, took Silas's name, and asked Lorraine, very politely, to start at the beginning. Lorraine started at the beginning. She told it the way Wendell would have wanted her to tell it, quietly, in order, without embellishment. The auction, the $8, Silas, the key, the lock, the smell of cigars. Detective Okafor took notes in a small leather-bound notebook and did not interrupt once. When Lorraine finished, Okafor looked at her for a moment. "Mrs. Bischoff," she said, "I'd like you to wait in my vehicle while I make some phone calls. It's warmer in there. I'll have the deputy bring you a coffee." She walked away from the truck and stood 20 feet down the gravel road with her phone to her ear. Lorraine watched through the windshield. She could not hear the words, but she could see Okafor's posture change as the call progressed, could see her straighten, then turn her back to the wind, then begin pacing in a tight 5-foot square. The call went on for almost 10 minutes. When Okafor came back, her face had a different quality to it. Not excitement, something more careful than that. The look of a person who has just been told, by a voice on the other end of the line, that the small case she thought she was working had become a much larger case very quickly. "Mrs. Bischoff," she said, "the FBI is sending 2 agents from the Billings field office. They will be here in about 3 hours. I would like you to stay with me until they arrive. Is that all right?" Lorraine nodded. "Detective," she said, "what is in those bags?" Okafor looked at her for a long moment. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I think they have been looking for those bags since before you were born." Special Agent Roman Castellanos arrived from the Billings field office at 14 minutes past 9 that night, in a black SUV with a younger agent named Priya Kothari behind the wheel and a forensics kit in the back seat. He was a short, compact man in his early 50s with the kind of weathered patience that suggested he had seen more strange things in 28 years with the Bureau than most people see in a lifetime. He shook Lorraine's hand. He shook Silas's hand. He listened to Detective Okafor's briefing in the cone of light from her cruiser's open door, and then he walked the 70 feet to the Pullman alone, climbed the iron steps, opened the door, and stood in the threshold for a full minute without moving. When he came back, his face had the careful composure of a man who was trying very hard not to let his face do anything. He sat down on the tailgate of Silas's truck across from Lorraine and lowered his voice. "Mrs. Bischoff," he said, "I'd like to tell you what you found. Is that all right?" She nodded. In June of 1934, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis shipped 14 sealed canvas bags of gold certificates and bullion coins from Minneapolis to San Francisco aboard a Northern Pacific Express train. The shipment was scheduled to be transferred onto a private business car somewhere in eastern Montana. The railroad allowed that kind of transfer in those days, and that private car was owned, on paper, by a man named Ezra Carraway, a retired Northern Pacific superintendent who was thought to be acting as a transit broker. The shipment was valued in 1934 dollars at approximately $4 million. In current valuation, depending on the gold price the day we appraise it, it is somewhere between $60 and $72 million. Lorraine put one hand flat against the side of the truck. The shipment never reached San Francisco. Castellanos went on, evenly. It vanished somewhere east of the Continental Divide. A man named James Carraway, Ezra's younger brother, who went by Silver Jim in the newspapers, was the suspected mastermind. The Bureau's working theory at the time was that he intercepted the shipment, transferred the bags into his brother's private car, and intended to disappear into Canada with the gold. He was never apprehended. He was never seen alive again after July of 1934. The case has been open for 91 years. He paused. "Mrs. Bischoff, I believe the man in that parlor is Silver Jim Carraway. I believe he died of natural causes, a heart attack, most likely, sitting in that chair sometime in the summer of 1934 before he could move the gold across the border. His brother Ezra apparently could not, or would not, open the car after that. He kept paying property taxes on the spur of land it was sitting on for the next 46 years. And when he died in 1980, the property passed through a contested estate that nobody in the family wanted. Eventually, the county seized it for back taxes. They sat on it for 16 more years. And this morning, you bought it for $8. Lorraine could not, for a long moment, find anything to say. "Agent Castellanos," she finally managed, "what happens now?" "What happens now," he said gently, "is that the contents of that car become federal evidence. The gold itself will be returned to the Treasury under the original 1934 chain of custody. The Bureau, under the Federal Recovery of Stolen Property statute, pays a recovery reward to the individual who reports stolen federal property and cooperates with its return. That reward is calculated at 10% of the recovered value before federal and state tax." The math arrived in her head before she could stop it. Castellanos saw her face and nodded slightly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. $6 to $7 million to you, depending on the appraisal. The paperwork will take 60 to 90 days. I want you to have a lawyer before you sign anything. And Mrs. Bischoff," he paused, "I'd suggest you find one quickly. Because as of about an hour from now, when Detective Okafor's preliminary report goes through the system, this story is not going to belong to you anymore." He was right about that. The story broke in the Bellweather County paper at 6 the next morning and was on the Associated Press wire by 8. By noon, it had been picked up by every major network in the country. Widow buys locked train car for $8, solves 91-year-old FBI cold case. The phone at Marchetti's Diner began ringing before Dottie had finished her morning prep. By the time Lorraine walked across the gravel from the Airstream to the back door of the diner for her bowl of soup, there were 3 news vans in the parking lot and a 4th pulling in from the highway. And somewhere in a rented studio in Bozeman, Chase Ormsby woke up to a phone full of notifications and discovered that the Junkyard King's footage of him calling an old woman grandma and asking the crowd if anyone had seen her family had been clipped, captioned, and shared 4.6 million times overnight, and that the comments section under his most recent video was a slow-moving avalanche of strangers telling him exactly what kind of man he was. By that afternoon, 2 of his sponsors had pulled. By the next morning, the third had followed. By the end of the week, his channel had lost 300,000 subscribers, and Sloane Devereaux had quietly removed any reference to Junkyard Kings from her social media bios. Kent Bischoff called Lorraine on the 3rd day. She did not answer. He called again on the 4th day. She let it ring. The lawyer Lorraine eventually hired was a woman named Antoinette Reyes Whitcomb, who went by Tony, who flew in from Denver on the 5th day after the story broke, and met Lorraine in a back booth at Marchetti's Diner with 2 cups of coffee and a leather portfolio. Tony was 51 years old, had argued 3 cases before the Ninth Circuit, and had taken one look at the news coverage of an elderly widow being mobbed by camera crews outside an Airstream trailer and gotten on a plane the same afternoon. She did not charge Lorraine for the first meeting. She did not charge her for the second. By the 3rd meeting, she had negotiated a documentary deal with a Swedish-American filmmaker named Jasper Lindqvist for $200,000, a book advance from New York publisher for $110,000, and had politely declined, on Lorraine's behalf, 11 separate speaking engagement offers from organizations Lorraine had never heard of. The federal recovery reward came through in 73 days. $6 million for $100,000 before tax. After federal and state withholding and Tony's modest contingency fee, Lorraine was left with just under $4.1 million in a bank account that, 6 months earlier, had held $43. She sat with that number for almost a week before she did anything about it. She sat with it in the Airstream, with a cup of tea cooling on the small folding table, and she thought about Wendell. She thought about the kitchen of the house Ken had taken from her. She thought about the senior apartment with the cheerful yellow curtains. She thought about the look on Lurleen Sparks' face at the auction table when Lurleen had used her name without being told it. She thought about how many widows in Bellweather County were currently sleeping in trailers behind diners, or on the couches of stepchildren who tolerated them, or in senior apartments where the curtains were yellow and the rent was twice what their survivor benefit could carry. She thought about how the world stops looking at a woman the day her husband stops looking back. When she was ready, she called Tony. "I want to buy the depot," she said. The Bellweather Junction depot had been sitting boarded up for 31 years. It was a 2-story brick building with a slate roof and a covered platform, built in 1911, abandoned when the Burlington Northern consolidated its routes in 1994, and nominally owned by the county, which had been quietly hoping somebody would burn it down so they didn't have to demolish it. Tony negotiated a sale price of $41,000. The county clerk who signed the paperwork was Lurleen Sparks, who, at the moment of signing, looked across the desk at Lorraine and said, very quietly, "I'm glad it's you." Lorraine bought the depot. She also bought, with Silas's help, the 70-foot stretch of orphan track at mile marker 7. And she paid a specialty crew from Spokane $47,000 to lift the Pullman car onto a flatbed and move it 3 miles down the line and set it permanently behind the depot, on a fresh stretch of restored rail, where it would sit as the centerpiece of what came next. What came next was a project that took 14 months and consumed a little over $2 million of her 4. She hired local contractors, almost all of them men over 60 whom Wendell would have known by name, and she restored the depot from the slate roof down. The waiting room became a small museum. The ticket counter became a working coffee bar. The freight platform became a community space with long farm tables and folding chairs. And on the 4 acres of county land behind the depot, which the county sold to her for $1 because she had asked nicely and they had read the news coverage, she built 6 small cottages. Each cottage was 840 square feet. Each had 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen, a covered front porch, and a garden bed in the back. Each was rented on a sliding scale tied to Social Security income, exclusively to widowed women over 65 who had been displaced from their homes after the death of a spouse. The waiting list filled before the cottages were finished. The first 6 women moved in on a Saturday in early spring. The oldest was 81. The youngest was 66. All of them cried at some point during the first day, and none of them apologized for it, because Lorraine had told them, when she handed each of them her keys, that there was no crying tax in this place, and they could pay rent in any currency except shame. She called the whole project the Wendell Bischoff Railway Heritage Site and Cottages. She put his name on the brass plaque by the depot door because he had earned it across 40 years of grease and copper and the kind of love that keeps protecting you long after the man is gone. The grand opening was on a Saturday in May, almost exactly 14 months after a woman with $8 to her name had raised her hand at a county salvage auction. Dottie Marchetti closed the diner for the day and brought every pie she had baked that week. Lurleen Sparks came in a dress instead of her usual cardigan, and she stood at the back of the crowd, and she cried quietly through the whole thing. Chase Ormsby did not come, but he sent a letter. Lorraine read it once, folded it, and filed it. She stood on the depot platform in front of the restored Pullman, and she looked out at the faces of the women in her cottages and the men who had built them and the friends who had remembered her name, and she said into the small microphone Silas had set up for her, "The world stops seeing widows the day our husbands die. But invisibility isn't disappearance. It's just other people refusing to look. I bought a train car for $8 because I had nothing left to lose. What I found inside it gave me back a life. What I'm giving back today is the only thing worth keeping, a place where women like me get looked at again." The applause went on for a long time. Lorraine Bischoff stood on the platform of her depot, with the Pullman behind her and the cottages behind that, as she put her hand into the inside pocket of Wendell's old denim coat, where the iron key still lived, and she closed her fingers around it, and she smiled. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.